Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my second episode on my podcast about forensic science. My name is Darian Booth, and if you're new here, this is a podcast where I reflect on what I've learned about forensic science, review famous crimes, and talk about current events. If you want to watch my first episode, it is up on my channel, so go check it out. Today, I will be talking about Locard's exchange principle from Learning Module 3 of my inquiry in Math and Science class. To those of you who might not know what Locard's exchange principle is, it states that a person who commits a crime will bring something to the crime scene and or leave with something from it. Fingerprints, gunshot residue, and blood are all the main pieces of evidence that are left behind at crime scenes. A few weeks ago, I completed an assignment about Locard's exchange principle where I examined my shirt after a day of working at my job. My shirt had pieces of cardboard flakes, tape, and marks of dust that had been picked up from the environment at my job. From the examination I did on my shirt, I was surprised to see that Locard's exchange principle can be applied to everyday activities. Another assignment I worked on involved building a concept map for physical evidence. From this map, I was able to learn three types of physical evidence, which is trace evidence, impression evidence, and biological evidence. Some examples of trace evidence include drugs, fibers, and shard glasses. For impression evidence, an example would be like a footprint in soil or any other kind of impression in the ground or environment. Lastly, for the biological evidence, the examples were a coffee cup with lipstick, blood splatter, dental records, and skeleton. Most of you already know, but every example for biological evidence has a DNA included. This way, the evidence can be linked to an individual if ever found at a crime scene. Now, I did have a confusion when mapping out my concept map, as I tied drugs, fiber, glass shards, footprint, coffee cup with lipstick, and blood splatter to Locard's exchange principle. However, Locard's exchange principle I placed at the bottom, while it should have been placed more higher at the top. Another great piece of evidence that can help out with solving crimes is eyewitness testimonies, which from a discussion I did with my class determined that with more witnesses, it would be easier to pinpoint details and actions of a crime. One downside to multiple witnesses is that there can be misconceptions that cause misinformation about the crime. Now that we have talked about Locard's exchange principle, reflected on some activities that I completed, and learned a little about eyewitness testimonies, we are going to talk about the famous crime spree of Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez grew up in El Paso, Texas, and during 1982 moved to California, where he would commit most of his crimes. Between June of 1984 and August of 1985, Ramirez would break into victims' homes and attack them as they slept. During this time, he would murder 13 people and assault 11. Specifically, during March of 1985, Ramirez went on a violent spree, killing 4 victims. 2 of these murders happened at a home of Vincent and Maxine Zara. At this location, police found their first clue, a footprint of a man's shoe. Later, in late spring of 1985, a second shoe print would be found at the location where a child was murdered. This second shoe print would appear to be similar to the one found at Zara's home. More pieces of evidence like footprints, witness testimonies, and gun casings would be found at multiple crime scenes. But a big turning point happened in late August of 1985. A witness saw a suspicious car driving in a neighborhood where recent attacks occurred, wrote down the license plate, and called the authorities. Shortly after, police found the vehicle abandoned and when examined closely, found a fingerprint that belonged to Richard Ramirez. After getting the name of the criminal, Ramirez was found, convicted of the murders, and was given the death penalty. When looking at this case of Richard Ramirez, there were numerous pieces of evidence at different scenes that were left behind by Ramirez. The footprint of the shoe he wore, gun casings, and most importantly, his fingerprint. All of these pieces of evidence are examples of Locard's exchange principle. If you want to read more about this famous crime, the URL is on screen and also located below in the description. Moving forward, we will talk about an article by the National Institute of Justice, or NIJ, called The Forensic Microbiome: The Invisible Traces We Leave Behind. This article is quite lengthy, but I did enjoy reading and learning about how people are currently solving crimes. The article starts off by talking about Edmund Locard and what the Locard exchange principle does for forensic science. Over the decades, forensic tools used to hunt for evidence has been improved. One example of this is in 2001 with the anthrax attacks in Florida, New York, and Washington, D.C. Letters containing deadly bacterial spores that cause anthrax were sent to several news media offices and to U.S. senators. 5 people died and 17 were infected. After investigation, the FBI found that a particular strain of the bacteria was traced to a scientist working in a government lab in Maryland. In 2001, after examining the anthrax at the lab, it was confirmed that the bacteria is linked to the attacks in 2001. After this, the article states that the government research teams are expanding the trace evidence humans can leave behind at crime scenes to bacteria, fungi, viruses, and other microbial evidence. The growth of microbial forensics led a scientist to conduct and complete research in 2019 on skin microbes that can be used for human identification. As with many research areas in science, the microbial forensic techniques are now being used to identify and limit the spread of SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. I was really surprised after reading this article that forensic tools are now being so advanced that they are able to isolate bacteria and viruses, which is now being used to stop the spread of COVID-19. If you want to read more about this, there is a URL on screen and will be located in the description as well. Alright everyone, looks like that is it for today's discussion on forensic science. I hope you learn a lot about Locard's exchange principle and how evidence at a crime scene can be connected to the perpetrator. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you return for my next podcast episode. Bye.